And now as we look across this valley that's behind me and to the top of that hill, you can see two church structures. There's a large, wide church structure with kind of a cone top on it. That's the Church of the Dormition. Then the bell tower next to it is where the upper room is, the traditional site of the upper room. When I say traditional, it was built in the Crusader times, but actually it was built on top of a synagogue that was built by the early church as the place that marked the upper room. Now think of everything that took place right there. First of all, in the Psalms, when you read David saying, "On my holy hill of Zion," that's what he was referring to. Zion is the top of the hill looking down at the city of David. So David called that the throne of God. That's the Old Testament. But the New Testament, and I'm getting right now to chapter 13 of the Gospel by John. If you ever read John 13, and that's the Last Supper and Christ washing the disciples' feet, or John 14, where Jesus said, "In my Father's house are many mansions," or 15 about abiding, or 16 talking about the Holy Spirit, all of those precious scriptures, John 13, 14, 15, and 16, were spoken by Christ right there in that spot. That is the site of the upper room. That's where communion began. That's where Jesus instituted the Last Supper. That's where Jesus taught the great lessons of John 14 about heaven, John 15 about the vine and the branches, and John 16 about the Holy Spirit. Right there. It's amazing to sit here. We're on the side of the Valley of Hinnom, to look across at Mount Zion. Between where we're seated and where you're looking from and Mount Zion is the deep valley of Gehenna. That's Mark chapter 9. Jesus talked about hell, and he said, in Gehenna, that's the valley of Hinnom. The trash from the city was pushed out from the walls. You can see the walls behind me. They pushed the trash down the valley, collected it in this valley of Hinnom, and according to the ancient historians, this valley often had kind of a smudge of smoke always coming from the garbage burning. That's what Jesus described hell as a perpetual burning. But think of the Last Supper up here, and I'm going to read this. Jesus, first of all, washed his disciples' feet. You remember they walked up to the room, and no one wanted to do the job of the slave. No one wanted to be the one that would wash the other's feet. So while they were all arguing over who should do it, Jesus takes off his outer coat, sets it aside, ties around his waist the towel of a slave, and goes to each of the disciples' feet. And it just so broke their hearts. And Peter, when he got to him, said, "Lord, are you washing my feet?" And Jesus said, "Yes, I am." And Peter said, "No." And Jesus said, "What I'm doing you don't understand, but you will know after." Jesus was giving an example. The only way that they could be prepared for the Lord's Supper was to humble themselves, to seek his cleansing. So that's chapter 13 from right there of the upper room. Then he goes into communion, the Last Supper. And as he's celebrating, Judas leaves. And the disciples whisper, "Why is he leaving? Is he going to do something?" And Jesus said, "The one that betrays me will take this morsel." And when he gave it to Judas, Judas left. And the whole betrayal began to fall into motion. And Jesus finished the Last Supper. Then he teaches chapter 14 about, "In my Father's house are many mansions. I am the way, the truth, and the life." Then he goes on to chapter 15 and says, "I am the true vine." Then he goes on to chapter 16 and says, "Until now you've asked nothing in my name. Ask and you will receive, that your joy may be full." And he promised the Holy Spirit. Then he said, "Let's get up." And it says, and they got up and they walked to the Garden of Gethsemane. So Jesus walked from Mount Zion over the hill behind and went down into the Kidron Valley, the other valley. This is the Hinnom. On the other side of that hill is the Kidron, and went to Gethsemane. After Gethsemane, he was praying. It says that they went in across the brook called Kidron into a garden called Gethsemane, and there he prayed, and that's where he was arrested, and he was brought back around this corner of what we would call the upper room, and went there to the praetorium of Pilate. Some very special lessons. What did Jesus do here? Number one, he modeled what it means to be a humble servant. When no one else would wash the feet, he washed the feet. When everyone else was too proud to do the job of a slave, he did the job of the slave. But he didn't rebuke the disciples. What he did is he modeled humility. And then he promised to them his presence. And then he promised to them that if they abided in him, they would bear much fruit. And then he promised his Spirit would come. That's what he did here. One last thing to look at the upper room and think about. That's the spot of Pentecost. That's the spot where the Holy Spirit fell on the disciples. They were in that upper room on Mount Zion. They were praying. They were gathered together, about 120 of them, when all of a sudden, in the morning, at the 9 o'clock hour, the sound of a rushing wind surrounded them, and tongues of fire, flames of fire were over each of their heads, and they were filled with the Spirit, and the church was born. The day of Pentecost began right there, where the Lord's Supper began, where the disciples met in fear and first saw Jesus as he came to them, walking through the closed doors. All of those things on Mount Zion, all of those things right in front of us on the other side of the Valley of Hinnom, and all of those things right here in the land of the book. What a privilege to know what Jesus did as he died in our place, right here in Jerusalem, and sent his Spirit.